I'm Tara Ursell, a PhD student at UC Davis studying forest ecology and management. Today, I'm going to be presenting on tree recruitment and forest expansion following reforestation in the Western Sierra Nevada. I'm presenting this work along with my co-authors, Jim Sanchirico and Hugh Safford, and I'd also like to note that this work was funded by CAL FIRE via the California Climate Investments Program. Oops. This study really gets at the question of whether strategically planting trees can lead to broader forest recovery in the long term. The idea has been tested in other contexts to see whether it's possible to get a greater bang for your buck when it comes to funding restoration, both in terms of accelerating successional processes within the restoration site, as well as outside of it. So here I'll mention two long-term studies. In the first, testing the efficacy of planting tree islands rather than widespread plantations in former agricultural sites in Costa Rica. And the second, testing a similar strategy of planting oak trees within abandoned agricultural land in Spain. The question is, does this strategy make sense in pine-dominated and mixed conifer forests in the Western Sierra Nevada? I'm going to guess that by now you have seen a few other presentations from the session and know a bit about forest and fire ecology in this region. Here, for this study, the most important thing to know is that these trees are adapted to fairly frequent, low to moderate severity fires, meaning that many trees survive these fires to act as seed sources for subsequent generations. The conifer trees in this area do not have a seed bank and do not resprout. So recruitment really does depend on proximity to a seed tree. Previous work has shown this empirically, as well as that site conditions like soil parent material can influence where seedlings recruit. And it's also important that seedlings recruit fairly soon after a wildfire. There are several shrub species that compete heavily, and it's important for seedlings to get a head start before they're overtopped. The third and fourth cartoons show this dynamic, where seedlings arriving to the mineral soil can establish as shrubs start to resprout or seed in. And as you have probably learned, wildfires have been getting larger and more severe, resulting in vast regions without seed trees. The widespread scale of wildfires and the lack of seed trees has raised questions about what role tree planting can play to ensure forest recovery. As we all know or can imagine, planting comes with its own set of challenges, from having appropriate genetic stock to begin with, to raising seedlings in nurseries, to having safe, accessible areas to plant them, to actually going into the field and getting the job done. So in light of this, a recent review proposed a three-zone approach to reforestation. In the first zone, don't plant in areas adjacent to unburned or surviving pockets of trees because natural regeneration there is more likely. 2, plant trees in areas that are accessible and safe and where natural regeneration is unlikely. 3, and most important for this study, plant small stands of trees in areas that are fairly inaccessible or logistically challenging so that they can serve as a nucleus for seeding the surrounding area in the future. This is the founder stand idea. We decided to examine the question of whether these founder stands would actually be likely to seed the surrounding area by performing an observational study of existing planted stands. We asked the question of whether reproductive planted stands are associated with seedling establishment outside of the stand. If planted seeds are important contributors to seed availability, we would expect to see recruitment within dispersal distance of a planted stand. Another hypothesis is that by the time planted trees grow and become reproductive, there's too much competing vegetation, shrubs, for additional cohorts to establish, in which case we'd expect to see seedling occurrence and density reduced by shrub competition. We sampled in 3 areas that were planted about 25 years ago and are now reproductive. Each of them had patches or adjacent areas that were left unplanted, either for a research study or where we could discern no environmental reason for the planting boundary. And in the slide, hopefully you can see my arrow, there are some squares that are the unplanted areas left for research purposes. We surveyed plots in transects that crossed these plantation boundaries and therefore in their distance to seed sources. One plot was within the plantation, one was just adjacent to it, and the other two were outside the expected dispersal range. At each plot, we characterized the competitive environment, including taking shrub cover and height measurements for the dominant shrubs. We also measured distance to alternate seed sources to control for seed availability from large surviving trees or natural regeneration that recruited just after the wildfire and is therefore similar to the planted trees. So what did we find? First of all, I'll focus on ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine seedlings, here aggregated as yellow pine, since they make up a vast majority of the planted trees. In fact, no other species were planted in high enough density for us to have a reasonable expectation of assessing seed rain. We used a binomial model to predict whether a yellow pine species would occur in a given plot, and we used a negative binomial model to predict the densities at each plot. We found that yellow pine seedling occurrence was significantly less likely further from the plantation, suggesting that there is some support for the dispersal limitation hypothesis. In other words, planted stands seem to be contributing to seedling regeneration. We did not find that seedling occurrence nor density varied with shrub cover. In other words, no support for our competitive impacts hypothesis. Taking a closer look at the plantation effect, or the dispersal effect, the figure on the left shows how seedling occurrence varies based on distance to the planted stand. We can see that even within the planted stand itself, there was only about a 65% probability of finding a seedling. This, of course, declines as we move farther away from the plantation and outside of the area where seed rain is expected. Next, I'll show the results for all tree seedlings, not just those that could have come from the planted stand. This is to assess whether planted stands could change recruitment patterns aside from providing seeds. Here again, we see a strong effect of being within or adjacent to the plantation, with the probability of observing a seedling declining as you move away from the plantation, and the density of seedlings declining with distance as well. And once more, we do not find an effect of shrub competition. Interestingly, we do find that the density of other natural regeneration in the plot was a strong predictor of both seedling presence and density. This other natural regeneration consists of seedlings, saplings, or other small trees that are too large to reasonably have come from the planted stand. So we expect that they came from other large seed trees in the region and recruited just after the wildfire. Assuming that those seed trees still are present, it makes sense that the more natural regeneration there is, the more small seedlings there are as well. In this plot showing seedling density across distances from the planted stand, we see a density of about 3 seedlings directly within planted stands and slightly declining with distance. To translate this to a per acre basis, this means that just outside of the plantation at 10 meters, you have a density of about 30 trees per acre. This is potentially within the historical range, which estimates adult trees at 10 to 32 trees per acre. But it's well below the typical stocking density of Forest Service plantations, which is more in the range of 200 trees per acre, or 70 trees per acre in mature forests. So you might be wondering why we didn't see an effect of shrub competition. One reason has to do with the study design. As we sampled, shrub cover and volume varied much more between than among locations, making it difficult for us to draw conclusions about shrub effects relative to other factors. Perhaps more compelling is that it might be that shrubs simply affect different life stages than the ones we were evaluating. We found that even when seedlings were present, they were substantially overtopped by shrubs. This photo shows some anecdotal evidence where you can barely see the seedling underneath a dense shrub overstory. The chart also shows that the shrubs in darker gray are substantially taller than seedlings in lighter gray. This is true within the El Dorado and Tahoe sites, as well as the low elevation sites in the Sierra National Forest that are currently dominated by manzanita. At high elevation Sierra National Forest sites, seedlings and shrubs are roughly equal. Given the likely effect of shrub competition on tree growth, it might be the case that even where shrubs do not inhibit seedling establishment, there may be later effects on those seedlings' ability to grow. All right, to summarize, young planted stands can contribute to forest expansion, but we should probably temper our expectations for how much. And based on these data, shrubs are not limiting establishment, but may still compromise seedlings' ability to grow and serve as a seed source for further recruitment and forest expansion. With that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this presentation, and I invite you to ask questions during the Q&A or by email. I'd also like to thank my field technicians, my advisors and lab at UC Davis, and I'd like to thank CAL FIRE and the California Climate Investments Program for funding this research. See you at the Q&A.